Well, good afternoon and welcome to this session of Reviewer Meets Reviewed. My name is Caroline T. I'm Senior Lecturer in Islamic Studies at the University of Chester, and it's my pleasure to be hosting what promises to be a really great discussion today. I'm joined by Ashraf Hoque, today's author, and Pnina Werbner, today's reviewer. Before I hand over to Ashraf and then Pnina, let me just say a few words of introduction about each of them. So Ashraf Hoque is lecturer in social anthropology in the Institute of Education at UCL, and he obtained his PhD in anthropology at SOAS in 2011. Ashraf's research draws on ethnographic fieldwork carried out in England and in Bangladesh, and addresses questions of migration and diaspora, as well as issues in the anthropology of Islam and political anthropology. Besides various articles and essays, he's co-author of Mafia Raj, The Rule of Bosses in South Asia, which was published in 2018 by Stanford University Press. And of course, he's the author of Being Young, Male and Muslim in Luton, the book we will be discussing today, which was published in 2019 by UCL Press. Pnina Werbner is Professor Emerita in Social Anthropology at Keele University. In addition to more recent work in Botswana, Pnina has been a leading voice in the study of British Muslims, migration and diasporic communities for many years, and has worked extensively on Pakistani background Muslim communities in Manchester. Her 3 books on this subject, which trace processes of Pakistani migration over a period of 50 years, have been called the most comprehensive body of ethnography about any immigrant community in Britain. Pnina is therefore very well positioned to be reviewing Ashraf's book on the everyday lives of South Asian Muslim men in Luton. First, Ashraf and then Pnina will have approximately 30 minutes each to speak, which will be followed by a 5-minute break, and then we'll move on to Q&A. So Ashraf, first of all, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Caroline. I hope you can see me. Thank you, Caroline, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I just want to say how deeply honoured I am for not only being invited to the hallowed, albeit now virtual walls of the Royal Anthropological Institute, but also to be sharing a panel with Professor Werbner, who's been a personal hero of mine, someone whose pioneering work on British Muslims inspired my own work and was heavily informed by it. Now, I'm going to read from a script for most of my presentation, if I may. But before I do that, I have some slides that I'd like to quickly go through just to give you a flavour of the field site. Now, that depends whether I can work this thing, so hopefully I can find where I'm looking for. Okay, so this is Bury Park in Luton, which is the district of the town where the majority of the post-war new Commonwealth migrants to the UK settled. Lots of anthropologists go off to very exotic places around the world. I ended up in this place. And this is a shot of the main thoroughfare in Bury Park, Dunstable Road, which, as you can see, is quite colourful. Now, coming down to the earth, this is a shot of the thoroughfare, and you can see there's lots of different types of shops there, owned by Bangladeshis and Pakistanis predominantly. You can always tell a South Asian enclave in the UK by the absolutely giant sacks of onions that you can see parked there in the corner. Now, Luton is a very interesting place because it's often referred to in the press as a hotbed for radicalisation, and this is due to the fact that a now proscribed extremist organisation called Al-Muhajirun used to be very active and is now reportedly underground and still active in Luton. And they used to do a daily stall on Dunstable Road, which caused the ire of the local community to such an extent that it boiled over during just after my time in the field. And the chap that you can see right at the center of the screen there with the green cap was actually one of my key gatekeepers in Luton, who is part of the Salafi Muslim sect, but he's part of a branch of the sect which is politically quietist. And him and people from his particular mission were very vocal in their umbrage towards this stall set up by Muhajirun, who also claim to be Salafis, but are sort of quote unquote jihadi in their approach. So this was a confrontation that occurred where the local Muslim community came out to expel al-Muhajirun from propagating their ideas in the town once and for all. Now, Muhajirun gained notoriety in 2009 when they protested against the homecoming march of the Royal Anglican Regiment, who were returning from Afghanistan. And they set up a counter demonstration on the route of that march, criticizing the war in Afghanistan and calling it a war against Muslims, and calling for the sanctioning, to put it mildly, of British soldiers in Afghanistan. This is quite a controversial moment at the time, and what it did was it inspired the formation of the English Defence League by its leader at the time, Tommy Robinson, who goes by the name Tommy Robinson, who was a famous football hooligan in the 1980s for Luton Town Football Club. His real name is Stephen Lennon. This led on numerous occasions to EDL marches through Bury Park, as you can see there in that image, trying to reclaim the town for themselves. And I'm just going to show you a few images of these marches. So here we've got Save Luton, Our Country, or Lose Our Country. Here's another one, English Defence League, Luton Council, Al-Qaeda Stronghold. Here's a very charming man at the centre of the screen there. Again, a march organised by the EDL. And sort of the latest iteration of this far-right interest in Bury Park is another organisation called Britain First, which actually contended, sought office in the 2017 elections, didn't manage to, but they also do what they call Christian patrols around the streets of Bury Park, asking everybody to leave. Okay, so I'm going to end that now, and I'm going to start reading. I hope everything's successful. If not, somebody I'm sure will tell me. Okay, so the book seeks to provide an anthropological account of the lives of young British-born Muslim men of South Asian origin in the English town of Luton. Luton is a satellite town in close proximity to London, situated around 30 miles to the north of the city. It is an important town. Many of its inhabitants work in London, which is a convenient 40 minutes train journey away. Luton also boasts an international airport, which plays a significant part in providing air travel needs for most of southern and central England. The town is further served by the M1 motorway, which connects London with Leeds in the previously industrial north of the country. In a previous life, Luton was also an industrial town in its own right, famed for its manufacture of hats and then later commercial and domestic motor vehicles. Since the turn of the century, however, these industries have all but vanished, with the manufacturing industry being steadily replaced by the services sector, a phenomenon consistent with national trends. Historically speaking then, Luton is not a remote town. Its sophisticated transport links, coupled with once thriving industry, has encouraged people from up and down the country to pass through, work, and settle in its environs. Among these settlers is a substantial Muslim community, around 19% of the overall population of the town, which is approximately 200,000 people. These Muslims predominantly reside in a concentrated neighbourhood situated in and around the Bury Park area of the town, which I mentioned at the top. Like many of the town's inhabitants, they were attracted to Luton during its industrial zenith, taking up employment in the Vauxhall Motor Company, its brickyards and engineering factories. Over the years, Muslim residents have burgeoned into a sizable settled community where new generations who were born and raised in the town now call it their home. My fieldwork was conducted in this post-industrial landscape among this new generation of Britons. The chief concern of the book is to demonstrate, through observations of their everyday lives, the various ways British-born Muslim men in Luton develop understandings of themselves that transcend the monolithic impressions of contemporary British Muslim communities, which maintain some ubiquity within wider society. I suggest that young Muslims in Luton are developing hybridized forms of Islam in an attempt to find alternatives to the culturally exclusive state narratives of nationality and citizenship. I argue that the syncretic experiences with conventions of the South Asian Muslim home, coupled with interactions with the influences from mainstream British society, has led to the rejection of both points of cultural reference. Rather, young British Muslims are looking to Islam, its glorious past, and the international Muslim community, or Ummah, as a means of reconciling both the alienating cultural practices of the home and the perceived Islamophobia and defilement of society beyond. By resorting to an abstract re-articulation of Islam, young Muslims are readapting their communal affiliations to suit the social and cultural terrain of Britain, while simultaneously creating a counter-discourse to accepted notions of Britishness and national belonging. Although a substantial and credible corpus of sociological and anthropological literature has emerged in recent decades, seeking to situate and problematize British Muslim communities, this study aims to further illuminate the inherent complexities and resultant messiness of such a task. Furthermore, I aim to provide an analysis of Muslims in Britain that attempts to depart from certain conceptions that view diaspora Muslims as a separate cultural bloc, to an understanding that identities are historically fluid, constantly in flux, and continuously shifting social categories and markers. The book is a contribution to scholarly approaches to the anthropology of Islam, both past and present. Anthropological approaches to the study of Islam and Muslims have been much contested in the subdiscipline's relatively short history. Interest was sparked by Clifford Geertz's famous thesis on the importance of religious symbols in providing cosmological meanings to individuals' everyday lives. This cultural view was challenged by Ernest Gellner's sociological interventions, who argued that Islam is a means by which society is ordered. Gellner suggests that since Islam is a scriptural religion, which lays down permanent laws and principles pertaining to how to organize society, and given that that scripture was completed by the mission of the Prophet Muhammad, Muslim societies were one where religion and the state become enmeshed as one. Sociological order, therefore, is sustained by a class of proto-politicians who are also religious authorities at the same time, much like the Prophet himself. Furthermore, that it is this class of scholar come politician that provides for social order and consequent solidarity in Islamic communities. Michael Gilsenan, however, took a different approach. He argued that Islam, or religion more generally, should not necessarily be the primary focus for anthropologists when studying Muslim societies. Rather, other social, economic, and political factors need also be incorporated if one is to attain a holistic ethnographic account of the people and communities under study. For Gilsenan, Islam was indeed a core component of life in the Middle East, where he worked. However, the weight of the other conflicting and parallel social phenomena coexisting with the religious meant that any account where religious symbols or agents provide a totalizing coherence to quotidian lives did not suffice as an accurate ethnographic picture of lived realities. In tandem with these epistemological developments was the idea proposed by Abdul Hamid al-Zain that there is no such thing as an anthropology of Islam. He suggests that both Geertz and Gellner were guilty of essentializing Islam in their respective symbolic and sociological approaches. For al-Zain, Islam was only relevant in local contexts where religion took particular vernacularized and idiosyncratic social forms. How Islam was socially articulated in Tanzania is quite different from, say, Indonesia, for example. The logical conclusion, therefore, is that ethnographic evidence suggests that there is no one Islam, but a collection of Islams that exist and have always existed in various parts of the world. It is thus the task of the anthropologist to draw out these differences for the purpose of comparative analysis, which he posits is the intellectual basis of the discipline. Perhaps the most ardent critic of this perspective is Talal Asad. In his seminal essay, The Idea of an Anthropology of Islam, Asad attempts to identify and define Islam as an analytical object of study. He argues against his forebears that Islam can be reduced as a system of symbols and social structure, or that it is a heterogeneous bundle of ideas, artifacts, customs, and morals. Instead, Asad claims that Islam is a discursive tradition, which is ultimately based on reference to the Quran and the Hadith, which are the biographical accounts of the Prophet. He suggests that all Muslims defer to the holy texts of Islam and place them above all other forms of ontological reference. In order to conduct a proper anthropological study of Islam, therefore, one must be prepared to locate particular religious or theological discourses that inform Muslim practitioners. Moreover, Asad alerts us to the idea that all Muslims seek and strive for a sense of religious orthodoxy in their lives, regardless of the respective sectarian differences that exist between different Muslim groups. All Muslims, he claims, are invested in practicing Islam in ways they deem to be acceptable in the eyes of God, linked to a particular conception of temporality. This discourse is always associated with scripture, but manifests in different ways in different social contexts. Quote, orthodoxy is crucial to all Islamic traditions. It is not a mere body of opinion, but a distinctive relationship, a relationship of power. Wherever Muslims have the power to regulate, uphold, require, or adjust correct practices, and to condemn, exclude, undermine, or replace incorrect ones, is the domain of orthodoxy. The way these powers are exercised, the conditions that make them possible, social, political, economic, etc., and the resistance they encounter from Muslims and non-Muslims are equally the concern of an anthropology of Islam, regardless of whether its direct object of research is in the city or in the countryside, in the present or in the past. Argument and conflict over the form and significance of practices are therefore a natural part of any Islamic tradition, end quote. Discerning correct practices from incorrect ones, therefore, is the vital part of any anthropological toolkit when exploring the lives of Muslims, according to Asad. Any endeavor that does not begin from the concept of a discursive tradition relating to the founding texts of Islam, as Asad quotes, as Muslims do, is futile since Islam is, first and foremost, a tradition. Assad's sophisticated and seemingly radical contention was well received by some, and a number of notable works have since emerged where Islam is indeed understood as a discursive tradition. These works broadly trace the role of religious law in informing ethical practices in the lives of pious Muslims. Although they do not deny the existence of a world beyond the mosque or religious court per se, protagonists are usually located within a habitus where religious seeking for the sake of spiritual coherence is pronounced. However, this can be misleading, since not all Muslims are seeking ethical and spiritual perfection all of the time, if this is indeed possible. Moreover, a number of more recent ethnographic accounts have demonstrated that Muslims are, more often than not, constantly oscillating between and traversing through a number of concomitant moral registers, regimes of truth, and multiple identities. These scholars propose that instead of focusing on textual Islam as an informative source for conducting ethnography, a more nuanced approach would be to demonstrate how Islam is lived by its adherents. Through this method, it's argued that anthropologists can observe the points of disjuncture, ambivalence, and quotidian slippages that litter the lives of Assad's discursive Muslim searching for orthodoxy, while at the same time, the lives of non-practicing, lapsed or nominal Muslims can also be absorbed into the anthropological gaze. In doing so, a more beleaguered, torn, and incoherent subject is brought to the fore, thereby demonstrating the complexities and contradictions of Muslim lives. In fact, Samuel Schilke, a keen advocate of the lived Islam approach, has even suggested that there is too much Islam in the anthropology of Islam. Although there is much to take note from Schilke's intersectional insights as a methodological starting point, particularly with regards to moving focus away from the ethical habitus, my own exposure to Muslims in Luton suggests that Islam, the text, and a quest for orthodoxy maintain resonance with all of my interlocutors. And I didn't meet a single person who claimed not to believe in Islam. Moreover, being Muslim not only meant striving for moral coherence, however difficult and thankless, but brought with it a distinct political identity that I suggest is particular to and seemingly acute among Muslims living in the West. The vast majority of my interlocutors struggled with being a good Muslim, but this did not deter them. Moreover, being Muslim in the post-9/11 world engendered my interlocutors with a will to represent and defend their religion against the perceived tide of antagonism and suspicion from white liberal society. I spent time with young men who purposefully missed prayers, refused to fast, dealt drugs, fornicated regularly, and yet argued that women should wear the hijab, planned trips to Mecca for pilgrimage, and always ate halal food. This ambivalence, as Schilke rightly puts it, stood side by side with a cogent, conscious, and coherent sense of the other, the other, within their own society. This manifested most prominently in a suspicion towards the discursive and institutional influences of the state, and a longing to be contingent with the utopian habitus of the international fraternity of Muslims, or Ummah. In the post-9/11 world, being a young Muslim in diaspora offers up a particular set of challenges. There is a qualitative difference between my interlocutors and their peers living in Muslim majority countries. It is premised on a particular history and retrospective memory of migration that is intrinsically linked with the global flow of colonial labor in the aftermath of World War II. These economic push factors, coupled with subsequent immigration restrictions, led eventually to the permanent settlement of mostly Caribbean and South Asian families in Britain. Of this cohort, Muslims comprised the largest ethno-religious group, predominantly originating from Kashmir, Punjab, Gujarat, and East Bengal. My young interlocutors in Luton were well acquainted with stories of such migration, the struggles that pioneer migrants faced when they first arrived, and importantly, how the fortunes of their family, both in Britain and South Asia, were revolutionized and transformed as a result. Once settled in Britain, these working class strangers, as they were referred to then, were confronted with a host of institutional and political hurdles, particularly in the struggle for ethnic and racial recognition. Despite a sustained period of unified race-based political mobilization in the 1970s, the decade when immigration from the new Commonwealth was permanently curtailed, previous unity became fragmented following the advent of state multiculturalism as state policy in Britain. These were implemented in reaction to a series of race riots in the early 1980s, staged within ethnic ghettos across the country. The British government's response to structural racism, on this occasion in the specific form of police brutality, was to instigate a set of policies that sought to celebrate cultural diversity. In effect, it disintegrated previous class solidarities as various ethnic groups jostled for newly ring-fenced state funds and recognition. This period of structural change, I suggest, produced certain material and discursive conditions that succeeded in cementing particular conceptions of British Muslim communities, both internal and external, that survive to the present day. Moreover, arguably no other event, including 9/11, has played a more significant role in simultaneously illuminating and demonizing British Muslims than the Satanic Verses affair of 1989. Multiculturalist policies implemented throughout the 1980s attempted to institutionalize essentialist conceptions of minority cultures by encouraging different minority groups to vie for government subsidies. Arun Kudnani suggests that, quote, different ethnic groups were thus pressed into competing for grants for their areas. The result was that Black communities became fragmented, horizontally by ethnicity, vertically by class. British Muslims became one such group, who were propelled into the public imaginary by the fervent protest and public burning of the Satanic Verses in Bradford, a northern ex-mill town where a substantial Muslim community continued to reside. These scenes were received with horror by white liberal society, as sensational images of people burning books circulated in the press brought back memories of Nazi Germany. Prior to this watershed moment, British Muslims were seen as Asians or even as politically black. The Satanic Verses affair separated British Muslims from other minority groups. It made them visible. Moreover, it was a public expression of the multiculturalist vision, albeit an unintended one. Muslims became identified along ethno-cultural lines, along with other minority groups, such as British Sikhs, for example. Culturally, they were no longer British Pakistanis, but were now primarily recognized as British Muslims. The controversy created a seminal shift in both how the wider British public viewed Muslims within their midst, and also how Muslims themselves self-identified. By the time my millennial interlocutors witnessed the events of 9/11 and later the London bombings of 2005, they were already socialized along ethno-religious lines. Multiculturalist policies and public discourse, therefore, played a direct role in cultivating communal identities. Notably, its implementation followed on from the breakdown of trust between ethnic minority groups and the state, caused by fundamental structural inequalities. Moreover, although similar patterns of settlement could be observed throughout Europe and North America at the time, the British case is specifically contingent on a particular colonial genealogy. Any credible ethnographic inquiry on British Muslims of South Asian origin, therefore, must be sensitive to these formative historical machinations. Such conditions, specific to diaspora, provide an additional metonymic node to the anthropological study of Islam in order to move beyond classical fixations on tribes, harems, and men of piety. Its catchment must include the study of diaspora, post-colonial subjectivities, and transnational social forms. The book thus attempts to supplement anthropological work situated in the center of the Islamic world through an appraisal of its peripheries. It draws ethnographic attention to how state narratives and policies possess the potential to balkanize its citizenry, explores the teleological impact of migration and generational renewal, and demonstrates how Muslims born in minority status are developing novel political identities in the post-9/11 world. In doing so, it expands on classical and contemporary debates within the anthropology of Islam and provides an area of inquiry that embraces both textual and quotidian approaches to studying Muslims. Moreover, it sheds ethnographic lives on the lives of those Muslims who, as Oliver Roy argues, are culturally and territorially detached from the Islamic world. Homi Bhabha suggests that explorations of the fragmented cultural identities of post-colonial subjects, particularly those generated within the modern diaspora, must escape essentialist paradigms and seek to unearth the discursive spaces that exist in between dominant political and ontological discourses. Bhabha's proposition of the third dimension is particularly pertinent for our purposes here. He argues that the historical ruptures and transformations which occur as a result of mass movement of people across continents profoundly disrupt the applicability and generation of previously held traditions. Confronted with a new environment, minority subjectivities embark upon a process of novel and innovative rearticulation. He argues that what is theoretically imperative and politically crucial is the need to think beyond narratives of originary and initial subjectivities and focus on those moments or processes that are produced in the articulation of cultural difference. The in-between spaces provide the terrain for elaborating strategies of selfhood, singular or communal, that initiate new signs of identity, an innovative site of collaboration and contestation in the act of defining society itself. Bhabha focuses on the idiosyncratic character of new hybrid forms of identity that occur as a consequence of cultural interaction. He identifies a third space, which is invisible to prevalent homogenizing discourses of the nation state, where cultural meanings and subjectivities are continually reproduced and innovated to create cosmopolitanisms that transcend and undermine national narratives of cultural homogeneity. Barber's approach corresponds with the way my own interlocutors generated new identities in the in-between spaces of the home and wider society, informed by the attitudes and discourses that dominate both spheres and yet are distinct from it. Diaspora cultural reproduction or production of this kind is further verified by the works of Paul Gilroy. Based on research conducted among Britain's post-war Afro-Caribbean communities, Gilroy locates the production of Black identities in the diaspora within the milieu of anti-racism struggles in Britain throughout the 1970s and 1980s. He focuses on the popular appeal of politically subversive Afro-Caribbean music produced in this period. Through various cultural mediums, Gilroy contends that Black youth developed dynamic forms of political resistance that were unique and flexible, and that went beyond classical forms of proletarian organization. He is critical of traditional Marxist cultural approaches, which seek to simply situate working class Black expressive cultures as characteristically anti-racism, and suggests that Black British culture transcends the narrow confines of the politics of anti-racism and ethnic absolutism, and incorporates all the taxonomical complexities of race, ethnicities, nation, and culture, as well as class, to produce something new and unremarked. He writes, Black Britain defines itself crucially as part of a diaspora. Its unique cultures draw inspiration from those developed by Black populations elsewhere. In particular, the culture and politics of Black America and the Caribbean have become raw materials for creative processes which redefine what it means to be Black, adapting it to distinctively British experiences and meanings. Black culture is actively made and remade. Gilroy alludes to a process of cultural syncretism that emerges within the Black diaspora in Britain, which galvanized at a particular political moment. Yet at the same time, he reminds us that the diaspora should not be analysed as separate from the British social fabric. Black culture, he argues, should be considered a significant interlocutor within the ever-in-process British cultural mosaic. An intricate web of cultural and political connections binds Blacks here to Blacks elsewhere. At the same time, they are linked in the social relations of this country. Both dimensions have to be examined, and the contradictions and continuities which exist between them must be brought out. This approach is entirely opposite within the context of my interlocutors in Luton. Like Black youth in the 1980s, young Muslims have developed politicized identities in the face of turbulent global events and the burgeoning of local suspicions against them. In contrast to Gilroy's Black youth, it is not necessarily their race which is divisive in social relations, but their religion. Moreover, it is the dual cultural and political capacity of the imagined Ummah that binds Muslims here to Muslims elsewhere, within a domain of mutual struggle and solidarity against neoliberal forces of domination. Similarly, Stuart Hall reminds us that identity should not be viewed as an already accomplished fact, but as a production which is never complete, always in process, and always constituted within, not outside, representation. He posits that displaced communities attempt to collectively essentialize identity in an attempt to impose a shared culture, even where this process seems difficult to engender. Cohesion, he argues, is achieved through displaying unified projections of ideological solidarity, even where such solidarity is superficial or artificially imposed. Borrowing from Fanon, he suggests that the experience of colonization has contributed towards the emptying of the native's brain from all form and content. Colonial authorities, he posits, reshape the historical trajectories of the subject populations to the extent of distorting, disfiguring, and destroying them. Once fully conscious of these historical mutations, the colonized attempts to unearth that which the colonial experience has buried and overlaid. He concludes that cultural identities are the points of identifications, the unstable points of identification, which are made within the discourses of history and culture, not an essence, but a positioning. Hence, there is always a politics of identity, a politics of position, but which has no absolute guarantee in an unproblematic transcendental law of origin. Black British identity has emerged from heterogeneous roots as slaves were taken from different countries, tribal communities, villages, language groups, and religions. However, the specific conditions of displacement and diaspora have led to the generation of novel Black British subjectivities that seek to reach beyond the confines of the exclusivist nation state. Black Britishness functions as a unifying counterculture against the toils of social marginalization. Similarly, in Luton, the Ummah was conceptualized as an effective means of reconciling a sense of perceived otherness in society, made possible by Orientalist stereotyping of Muslims as exotic, visceral, and violent in the popular imagination. My interlocutors, self-identifying as they did, thus must be contextualized within this specific historical, social, economic, and political developments that have shaped their intersectional and often contradictory opinions, emotions, and loyalties throughout their lifetime. These conditions have given rise to unique vernacular and hybrid forms of British Muslim identity based on national and transnational solidarities, historical class struggles, personal piety and salvation, and a recalibration of what it means to be British in today's post-colonial Britain. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I don't know if somebody's going to come in.
Yep, brilliant. Thank you, Ashraf. That was a brilliant introduction to a fascinating book. And I'm sure if people in the audience haven't yet read the whole book, they will now have had their appetites whetted to do so. So let me invite Pnina to join you and to offer her comments. I'm going to disappear again and leave the two of you on screen. So Pnina, over to you.
Okay, can you see me?
Yes.
I can see the name Caroline. Wait, let me see if I can get it to gallery view I've got. It's better than before. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Ashraf. You give me the pleasure of describing your ethnography, since you've talked about all the background theory to it. And that's a very great pleasure because it's a wonderful ethnography. I really recommend reading it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start, but I'm going to read bits of my review, and I'm going to kind of comment a bit on my review and maybe ask you some questions as well. And in the end, I'm going to ask you some questions which may be a bit challenging. Right, so let me start. Luton is a horrible town. So opens chapter 1 of this hard-hitting ethnography about young Muslim men, primarily Pakistani, living in Berry Park, a majority Muslim neighborhood. Now, let me start with a question to you, Ashraf, just to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
How long did it take you to write that first sentence? A wonderful opening.
I have to be very honest. I mean, this was the first line that I wrote ever about Luton, actually, and it amused. When I got back from the field, we had to do a post-field work presentation to colleagues, and that's the first line I read, and they all they had the same response. So, I mean, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Obviously, I don't believe that Luton is a horrible town, but I was trying to sort of depict my initial impression of the town, which it is quite prosaic and stark. And it's, I suppose, I'm trying to include some of the unsavory characters that have emerged from there and contributed to this idea of it being a site of fear. People like Tommy Robinson and
so it's not your personal opinion, you don't think?
Well, I grew to love Luton, and I don't think it's a horrible town anymore. But it was an initial impression that I had that I felt I had to document.
Right.
This sort of.
Okay, so let me go on. Luton, despite being a small town, is infamous, as we saw on the slides, as a site of fear. Author tells us, mainly because of its activist branch of Al-Muhajirun, a radical Islamist group that influenced several British Muslim suicide bombers and murderers, openly demonstrated against the Royal Anglian regiment's return from a round of duty in Afghanistan, protested against the Danish cartoons, and expressed its support for ISIS in Syria. The Muslim community of Luton, comprising, as Ashraf already told us, 19% of the 200,000 strong urban population, so that's about 40,000 Muslims, is mostly of working class Pakistani Kashmiri origin. The first generation migrants came to work in the Vauxhall Motor Company and other factories in the 1970s. This is a book about their sons and even more so their grandsons, for whom Luton is the home that they love, claiming to be loyal to Luton before anywhere else in the world. So that's the other side of it being such a horrible town. Now, being young, male, and Muslim in Luton is barely 100 pages, and that in itself is an achievement. I don't know how you managed it. Yet it packs a powerful punch, skillfully combining facts, theory, we heard the theory, so we don't need to talk about that anymore, and description, to provide insight into the reasons why third-generation young Muslim men combine the Islamic faith with everyday provincial Britishness. Ashraf Hoque provides brief interview, extracts, and biological sketches of a range of young. I mean, what's the great strength of this book is the vignettes that are so apt and so much kind of imply a more in-depth knowledge of the people who are being quoted or interviewed or described. So I think this is really a wonderful achievement of yours, Ashraf. You really have the talent, the writing talent, that doesn't often happen to, not all ethnographers are writers. And to put that into such a small space is itself an achievement. So he provides interview extracts and biological sketches of a range of young men and their choices of work, leisure, and religious observance. So we get a very good sense of the variety of people, their backgrounds, their work, the way they spend their time, and so on. These add a sense of lively concreteness to Akbar's main thesis, and the thrust of his argument, as we heard from him, aligns with anthropologists such as Marsden and Schilke, who argue against Talal Assad's definition of the anthropology of Islam as a discursive tradition for so-called living Islam approaches that highlight the everyday as a site of openness, indeterminacy, and ambiguity of religious practice. I think I would, join that particular trend, although I came before Schilke and Marsden, but still. Anyway, I mean, this is a much more anthropological approach, basically, which looks at the way especially young Muslims, often deviate from some kind of expectations of their elders and the pieties that are involved. So many young Muslims in Berea Park assert their Islamic identity, but are willing to compromise on a range of practices, from drinking alcohol to having English girlfriends or going on holiday to Ibiza. Significantly, Ashraf found the kind of Islam they prefer is decultured, stripped of Pakistani or South Asian customary forms of worship and celebration, in a transnational diasporic trend also analyzed by Olivia Roy. Now, of course, this is true, Ashraf, but wait till they get married and then what happens to them? So luckily for Ashraf, he didn't try to study them when they were married. So we don't know when Pakistani customs and stuff crept back in, but when they were young and unmarried, mostly, they really wanted a kind of pure Islam. They didn't like all these cultural expectations of their parents, especially because these involved arranged marriages, which they often resisted, although they seemed to give in the end. Now, methodologically, the book's research focuses on several youth clubs in Bury Park and on young men attending the town's peaceful Salafi mosque, the recipient of an EU grant to study a young Muslim man that employed the Ashraf himself as a researcher. I wasn't sure how many of the town's Muslims lived in Berry Park. What do you think?
I think the vast majority live there, but it's spilt out recently, I've been told, and there are suburbs around Luton where there is a healthy sprinkling now.
I would imagine so. As people make money, and now we'll talk about that later, this whole question of what's happened to them. Although he did meet other slightly older young men, including some who attended university, the sample of Muslim youth studied by Ashraf is obviously quite selective. We know little of men growing up in other suburbs of Luton, Muslim men, or pursuing careers outside the ethnic enclave. So, in other words, we very much focused on the ethnic enclave and on young men, but there were some university students among them. Nor do we know those who have left the town. So there must be some who may have gone to live in London or Milton Keynes or St Albans. Within the enclave, men work as taxi drivers, small business owners, and entrepreneurs. Some are members of drug gangs set to monopolize the drug trade in the region, at times engaging in drug troth wars. Although drug trading is disapproved of by families, at least officially, they nonetheless accept the money earned by young family members who are involved in the trade. Now, the chapter of the book that was, for me, a little bit problematic, although I'm not sure because I've reread the book, the whole book in the last 2 days, is a chapter on family, mainly because it reifies, in my opinion, the notion of bridery, a complex term, as I've argued elsewhere, which can refer to a marriage network, a localized Muslim zat or caste, or 3-4 generation patrilineage in a shifting, situationally defined category or group. So bridery cannot be, in any sense, a corporate clan. And there is a sense in your writing of the chapter that you can talk about it as a clan. And maybe you had bad supervision on that, I'm not sure. So it isn't really a clan. It's not a clan ruled by a patriarch. And much of the networking in and outside the bridery is managed by women. Now, I want to ask you a question since I've got you in front of me, which I didn't have when I wrote the review. To what extent, I mean, you've got, call it 30,000 Muslim living within relatively close proximity, the majority of them coming from Kashmir. And they are now 3-generational families. Some of them, there were 3 brothers who arrived to work in the factory, and now they all have grandchildren, and you're really studying the grandsons. Now, in that situation, even that 3-generational family could be called a bridery, of course, even if there's no one outside that group. So the question is, do they all live together, or are they scattered? You can't live in these small terrace houses 3 generations, can you? Well, so one of the things I didn't quite understand is these brideries are composed of families, some of them more larger and some of them less, who are related, very closely related, within a generation of each other, and who live presumably within a residential area. Now that's one kind of notion of bridery, as a sort of 3-4 generational extended family. But there's also a second notion of bridery, which is as a marriage network. And marriage network extends very much more widely and more through affines as well as agnates. And the thing about the marriage network is that those are the group of people with whom you marry. But second, beyond that, the bridery is a caste, the name of a caste. They are Rajputs or Jats or Gujar. So tell me a bit about these caste groups within Luton.
Well, there are, from what I could glean, there are a few prominent ones that people kept mentioning. Arain being one, Gujar being one. Some people claim to be Jats, but the Jats were less prominent. The Arains and Gujars, there were Rajputs as well. Some people claim to be Raje.
Now, the Arains are not normally Kashmiris. They're more Punjabis.
Yeah, but there are some Punjabis families as well in Luton. Not everybody's from Kotli. But Gujars and Jats, some Rajputs. But some of the people I spoke to, some of the youngsters, particularly youngsters, they weren't so familiar with their caste groups and they didn't know.
It's a kind of euphemism. Brother is a euphemism for caste, so you don't mention caste because that's not allowed in Islam. So
yeah, possibly.
Yeah.
The other thing is that with regards to, I mean, you're absolutely right. There are people. What happens? I mean, I noticed that they extended homes to incorporate generations, and when they couldn't extend anymore, they tried to find a house as close as possible to the nucleus house, if you know what I mean.
Right. But when you have groups like Arai, for example, who often go into business and become very successful businessmen, I don't know if that's the case in Luton, then they want to move out to the suburbs. They use telephones and cars. So it isn't sort of as simple as you're kind of implying. But the real question also is, so you're saying they compete in mosques. There are 27 mosques in Luton, but they don't belong to brotherhood, these mosques, do they?
Well, this is another issue, because when I spoke to young people, my interlocutors about it, they always talked of mosques as biradri mosques. So it's our biradri's got that mosque, that biradri's got that mosque. And you're absolutely right insofar as it's the mosque committees that have, there's always a power struggle of who's controlling the mosque.
It's interesting that these groups, whatever they are, the Rajputs or the Arai or whatever, they do seem to control some mosques. Now, the parental generation are presumably Brelvi, all of them, which mostly, would imply that the mosques were pretty much Brelvi mosques, right? And the competition was for were they big mosques or were they very small mosques?
Well, there was a combination. There are some really big ones in Luton, and there are some smaller ones dotted around.
So who dominates the big one?
Brelvis and Deobandis. And then you've got the big Salafi mission now as well, which is a burgeoning one. And one of the attractions of the Salafi mosque is precisely young people saying, well, I don't want to get involved with all this biradri politics, and all of this stuff is hocus pocus superstition anyway. So I'm going to go there where I can listen to something in English and
it's interesting that you didn't really know about these politics of the mosque and so on. There was something about a Luton mosque which got into the press. I forget what it was. At some point, some scandal on it. Anyway, what you heard was a kind of notion of brotherhood that came out of young guys in their teens or early 20s, who first of all talked about the power of the patriarch, their father basically.
Yes.
Maybe their grandfather, but more or less their father.
Yeah.
And use the rhetoric of the brotherhood as a kind of threat. If you do this, the brotherhood you'll cause shame to the brotherhood. The brotherhood was a background threat, a sort of normative way of controlling the behavior of younger people. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, yes. I mean, there was the young people, not all of them, but and this wasn't the case with my Bangladeshi interlocutors. I have to make that clear. That's a completely different way of.
They don't have brotherhood.
Not in the same way. It doesn't manifest in the same way. It's actually very different. But with some of my young interlocutors, they were sick and tired of the expectations that they had from home and the Izzat code and what their, family expects them of, and, who they're going to marry, and behavior in public, and all this stuff. And they internalize that. I mean, biradri, the reason why I talked about biradri is that it was always any conversation a bit surface deep, biradri would come up. Oh, there are different biradri, and that's another biradri mosque, and and then you'd ask them, what do you think about this? And they'll say, oh, it's all a nonsense. But then sometimes they would fight. Some of them had a very strong, even though they were critical of biradri, if a biradri member, a cousin of theirs, was embroiled in some sort of, fracas with somebody from a different biradri background or caste background, then they wouldn't question, there would be an uncritical defense of that person. So it was quite a strong bond as well at the same time.
No, I think it's very interesting and important that they use the biradri as a kind of, as I say, as a normative background to their behavior. And but it doesn't help to understand it. You didn't really go into the ethnography of how these mosques and so on worked. So as I say in my review, although biradris don't seem to own separate mosques or found them, because in Pakistan they do. They are biradri mosques. And this is why I was puzzled. I wasn't sure. But the biradri factions may control a mosque committee, and of course biradris can be split down the middle and have internal quarrels, quite serious ones. Now, possibly young men in Luton explained their compliance with parental wishes to you, the ethnographer, in terms of the power of their father's authority within the biradri. But in-depth research would have, in all likelihood, revealed a more complex picture. Yeah, okay. Secondly, the book tells us nothing about local ranking, whether by Zat or class. So we don't really know anything about class in Luton. Maybe rather than talking about caste or biradri, can you tell us a bit about class in Luton? I mean, you haven't really, you've described entrepreneurs who own shops, but I didn't get a sense. In Manchester, there's strong class differences among Pakistanis. So what about Luton?
I didn't really get a strong sense of that, I have to admit, from my interlocutors. Bury Park is very working class. So there are, as I mentioned, there are suburbs to Luton where people who have done well from businesses and so forth, they tend to live further out, and their children wouldn't necessarily go to the same schools that I worked in or the same youth centres that I worked in. But there was a more sort of homogenous sense of class where I was working. Having said that, my key interlocutors, the gatekeepers that I had, there was a class difference between them. I found. So the imam of the mosque that I worked with, the key sort of preacher, he lived outside of Luton. He was Punjabi, so he wasn't from Kotli in Kashmir. I had conversations with him about it, and he said, he always made the point that he was a bit different from the people that lived in Bury Park, but nonetheless they were Muslims and everybody is the same. And obviously he was a bit of an ideologue, so he wouldn't want to dwell on caste and class differences. But among the older people, I could sense a distinction. But I mean, the people that I was working with at the skills project, what I call the skills project, were more educated. They had degrees from, somebody went to LSE, another person went to university in London. And so there was a difference amongst them, but amongst the young people, predominantly they were working class, quite poor actually, from poorer backgrounds.
So you had nothing really to do with the, well, there must have been at least a small Pakistani middle class in Luton. Bankers, lawyers, accountants, headmasters, I don't know,
Yes.
all kinds of people like that. They lived in the suburbs and they didn't seem to be
Yeah.
related.
Some.
Go on.
Sorry, Gina, I don't know if my connection seems to be crackling. There were some, for example, there were people who were IT consultants who went to university, who had the means to leave Bury Park, but chose not to.
Yeah.
But like you say, you made an important point about marriage. Who knows what will happen to them once they're married? But by the time when I was speaking to them, they were in their mid to late 20s and hadn't moved out of their home yet. So presumably they were commanding enough money to be able to move out. I mean, these are people that are working for KPMG and these huge consultancy and accountancy firms. So they're commanding a decent wage. They could afford to live outside, but they chose to live with their parents in Bury Park. I did come across other people through the skills project that I was working with who lived in and around Luton. So people that came from Bedford, people that came from Milton Keynes, people that came from Harpenden, who were part of the Salafi mission insofar as they wanted, they're very much involved with the work they were doing, but they had made their money and they're much older, they're in their 30s and 40s, but they would swoop into the town for events like mosque or to sort of some sort of dawah session with the younger people. So there were people like that who were from Luton and moved out, but the vast majority of the people that were still located within Bury Park were, I would say, working class. They hadn't done as well as the people that left.
And when they had weddings and stuff like that, did they have giant weddings?
Huge.
Huge weddings.
That took up the streets. And
because I mean that brings me to another question, because although there were these links within the Bradri, their links both as young men and as families were enormously varied within the community when it came to events like weddings, funerals, right? School. I mean, this was a community where people from different Bradris, if you like, different backgrounds, had very close friendships with each other. They had very close friendships with each other, yes? Okay.
Yes. I mean, I didn't attend any community weddings. I mean, beyond observing them in and about the neighborhood, and they were massive and there were huge cars and, lots of lights and lots of people about. But I did get secondary, accounts of these weddings and, and people were mixing. I mean, it's a very, certain streets are very tight knit. I'm presuming it's the same up in Manchester. People knew each other. There was interaction between different groups. And
well, Manchester was much more scattered, and there was much more differentiation. And young people were educated in Manchester on the whole. Very few not educated. So it was a much more middle class, ultimately middle class. Although they started similarly to your group. Now, I want to come back for the end of our discussion to this whole question of living Islam.
Yes.
Because here you've got a town which anyway has a bad reputation in terms of being a place of radical Muslims. But as you describe it, these young men are pretty religious, really. They at least ostensibly, and if they will tell you that we are Muslims and we'd like to pray 5 times a day, but of course we don't, but so on. So in other words, although however hybrid they might be in terms of clothing and food, you still eat halal food, right?
Yes.
And my question is, in the issue of radicalisation, there was a very good book on West Indians, I've forgotten the name of the book, Black, White or something. The point made is, if you have one part of your ideology, which is very coherent and makes sense in itself. And then another part which is fragmented, oh yes, I have a white girlfriend, but I'm not going to marry her. We go to Ibiza, it's fun, but we don't really mean to stay that way all our lives and so on. We do also go on Hajj and so on. Isn't it, in terms of you were hired to look at the potential for radicalization. And on the whole, a lot of these kids are following relatively doctrinaire, global kind of Islamic ideas. Whereas the Punjabi, cultural ideas on Islam were quite tolerant, and they didn't demand wearing hijabs. And so my question is, how much are these kids really vulnerable to radicalization? Right, but the hybridity is pretty superficial, as far as I can tell.
No, it's a great question. I don't. Okay, first of all, I had quite a skewered window into it, Pnina, because I was working specifically with an organization that was charged with de-radicalizing suspect people. So consequently, there was a lot of people that had returned from prison who had been involved in, who got radicalized in prison that these guys were working with, who are not representative of most of the community there. But also I was working with young people whose parents had already converted to Salafism, so to speak. So they were being nurtured within that particular milieu, looking at a sort of literalist view of it. But at the same time, the vast majority of Luton's population of Muslims are still Barelvi or they're Tablighi, Deobandi Tablighi. And Barelviism, as you know, is not interested in that form of political action. Well, this could be questioned now because of what's happened recently with, what's his name? Qadri. But anyway, that's a separate point. And the Deobandis are apolitical as well, famously. Tabligis
theoretically, or then, in fact, 511, the 5-7 bombers were Tablighi, I think. Pretended to be, yeah.
But the general thrust of Tablighis, they're famously apolitical. Right. So so my accounts admittedly could, my exposure to the youth in Luton was lopsided in a way. I sort of saw half of the young people that I worked with were affected by Salafi doctrine, whereas the other half were variants of different backgrounds. The Bangladeshis were, they were either Chisti Sufi order,
but they didn't have a coherent view of why you had to be a good British citizen, as they would have a coherent view of why you had to be a good Muslim.
Not necessarily. They didn't have a sort of discursive tradition of Britishness, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, that's what you're asking. This is what seems to me the worrisome part. They're very strong on the Islam, but not rather vague on.
Yeah,
just popular culture.
Yeah, that's a fair interpretation. They're big on popular culture, they music and movies and all of that. But there wasn't a coherent sense of what being British meant to them vis-a-vis what being Muslim meant to them.
Right. And I think that's complicated in terms of this notion of living Islam in hybridity. It's a bit complicated.
No, it's very complicated. And the thing is, the question was about radicalization, whether they're susceptible. They're not susceptible, to go to that extreme necessarily. Some are, some, you know, if it's pushed too far, then there are reasons for why some people on the margins, particularly, I mean, I saw some very, very unsavory characters who had violent pasts, who went to prison in and out, and who were very angry. And I sat in interventions with these guys, and they were not, I mean, I think it's less to do with religion with these guys and more to do with their own demons growing up and, you know, their own sort of position within society. But there is a concern, and I take your point, there is a concern for these young people growing up, feeling as though Luton is their home, and they're very loyal towards Luton, they love Luton. But the reason why they love Luton is because it's unlike the rest of Britain, which is perceived to be hostile to them.
Right. I'm going to stop now because I think there has to be time for President. I just want to read the last line of my review,
Okay.
which is that your book on Pakistani migrant, let me go. An imaginative and insightful monograph of young Muslims in Britain, the book deserves to be taught widely in introductory courses in anthropology. I think I have to thank you for that. I think it really is a splendid book for teaching undergraduates, especially. Right.
So
I think, Caroline, that we need to stop, no?
We do. It's very difficult to chair these online things because I can't sort of nudge you or give you a sideways look or anything without bursting back onto the scene. So thank you for finishing pretty much on time. That's great. And
I was never told the time anyway.
It's fine. We're doing fine. So we'll have a 5-minute break now, so people can just look at something other than a screen. Do feel free to keep typing your questions into the Q&A box over that 5 minutes if you have them. And when we start again at 23 minutes past 5, we will kick off with questions that are already in there.
Are you going to read out the questions?
Yeah, I will do. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Good.
we'll have a 5.
Thanks.
Pnina, yeah, 5-minute break, and then we'll start again at 23 minutes past. See you then.
Good.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope the break was welcome. If Pnina and Ashraf could...
I'm trying to...
me again, that would be great.
It says you can't start your video because the host has stopped it.
Oh, I think they might have turned you off because...
No, I think
yeah,
not.
there we go. There we go. You're both back. Great. So we've got lots of good questions. The first one is a question for Ashraf. Could you please give us a bit more information about your own identity and politics and how that connected with or disconnected from your respondents and their responses to you?
great question.
Yeah.
Okay, well, there's a lot to say on this one. My own identity, well, I'm of Bangladeshi heritage. My father was an immigrant here in the 60s. He was part of the Windrush generation. And I was brought up in, I'm from Sylhet in Bangladesh, where the majority of UK Bangladeshis are from. 95% of UK Bangladeshis are from Sylhet. And Sylhet is a very, it's a center of Sufism. It was actually proselytized by Sufis much earlier than other parts of South Asia. It's quite unusual because it's so far removed from the sort of interior of South Asia, or the sort of the hub of Muslim communities at the time. So I was brought up within that sort of Sufi milieu of Chistiya Sufism nominally, and in Bangladesh, I'm also from a middle class background, which was a difference which I felt palpably when I was working in Luton. And also on top of that, I grew up in Kingston in Surrey. And for those of you who are familiar with Kingston, in the 80s and 90s, I mean, still to an extent now, but in the 80s and 90s, there was hardly any ethnic minorities there at all, let alone Bangladeshi households. So I grew up in a majority white context, and I went through my own I suppose, identity struggles and issues growing up. I was a victim of a lot of racism growing up at school, in the place that we stayed at the time. And as I developed, I myself, became politicized as a result of my experiences of racism. So I was involved with Hizb ut-Tahrir when I was younger. During my A-levels, I was recruited by their very forceful campaigning in that time. But thankfully that didn't last long, but it was a symptom of my own identity issues. I've always been very left. My father was very left. He fought in the liberation struggle in '71. He was actually here at the time. He went back to fight as a guerrilla fighter against the Pakistan army. He was a lifelong trade unionist. He gave a lot of his money to the Labour Party, much to the irritation of my mother. And I suppose my sort of journey as a youth came full circle in my early 20s when I, reverted back to type, if you like, in terms of my own sense of religiosity and my politics. I'm quite leftist, I would say, and my political positionality. But it created, I don't know, there's a myth of I talk a little bit about this in the book, of so-called native anthropologists. And I just don't buy that, I'm afraid, because first of all anthropologists, we're all outsiders, really. I think we're all freaks to do what we do. So we never really fit in anywhere. And the other thing is that, even though I had pretensions and delusions, I suppose, that I was going to go and study my own, I realized very quickly that I was very, very different. Even though I could speak the language, I looked the same, there were obviously lots of overlaps because of our shared sort of diasporan experience. But here was a community where it was majority ethnic minority. I never grew up in that sort of environment. Most of my interlocutors' friends were of the same background as them. They grew up in a completely different kind of enclave that I did. So, a lot of it was a learning experience for me. And it did cause problems with my gatekeepers initially. I mean, it wasn't, I was working with Salafis and they're quite insistent on converting one. So I got involved in lots of discussions with them over the difference between Salafism and Sufism, and that's their sort of, pet debate. But I have to say that they were, very welcoming. They respected my differences. They didn't treat me any differently. I'm still in contact with them now. So yeah, it was. It wasn't what I thought it would be, and there was definitely a difference. I mean, there were times where people just couldn't understand what I was doing. Why are you doing this job? Why are you doing this job that people from the council do, from the local council do? Why don't you use your education and get a proper job that will pay you good money, and so you don't have to drive this banger around, stuff like that. So there was I think there was a cultural difference, a class difference, if you like. Politically, not so different. I think most people that I came across, I didn't come across many people who were on the right. But yeah, no, it did sort of slay my assumptions for sure.
Great, thanks, Ashraf. That was a question from Maya Unithan, who's had to leave, unfortunately, but I expect she can come back and listen to the recording. A similar question, so sort of follows on really. This is from Letitia Nagao. She would like to know about the reception of your work within the community, and particularly whether you discussed the ethnography with them and what their opinions were of your account.
Another great question. Well, I made it available to everybody because of the transient nature of the people that I spoke to. I didn't keep everybody, all the young people's contacts with me, but I did, obviously, the people that I spent the most time with. I retained contact with them and discussed it with them. It's a mixture between apathy, okay, fine, and some people were saying, yeah, this is an accurate representation of our town. So I was quite happy with that at the moment. I mean, it's only been out for a year, so I don't know. People will take umbrage at some point later on. I hope not. But thus far, I haven't received anything negative, really. But as I say, it's still early days, and it might come.
Yeah. Okay, next, a really great question from Judith Oakley, which I'm just going to read out because it merits it, I think. So she says, I did fieldwork among gypsies in a cathedral city some 40 or 50 miles south of Luton in the mid-1970s. When I was with gypsy women in a cafe or other public place, outsiders were fascinated and kept asking them where they were from. The gypsies usually hid their ethnicity. Often they would finally answer, we're from Luton. That answer silenced the outsiders. Why do you think that worked?
First of all, I'll say Judith Oakley, legend, IOE legend, absolute hero. Thank you for coming and asking the question. I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, Luton has a notorious reputation, doesn't it? And I know from speaking to my friends at the Skills Project that there was a lot of gangland warfare, turf wars going on there throughout the 80s and 90s especially. A gang called Men in Gear, which is people mentioned all the time, which was a mixture of different ethnic groups, I'm told. West Indian men, South Asian men, white men, presumably maybe traveller community people as well involved in that. But there were gangs that were quite fearsome in that time. Interestingly, the turf war happened between Bury Park Muslim gangs, and the Muslim gangs won. And so now, apparently, according to my interlocutors, that the Muslims now control the drug trade, not just in Luton, but that whole sort of Bedfordshire and wider sort of south region. So it could be something to do with that. I'm not sure. I mean, but it's a great question. Luton has, I mean, whenever I mention Luton to anybody, and if anybody's been there, it doesn't, people aren't jumping with joy. You know, everybody's got some story to tell, and the story is always not very flattering to Luton.
Okay, right. Next question. So we've got a couple of connected questions on gender. The first one is asking how ideas of gender played out in the creative recreation of identities, and particularly the observation that young men still believe that women should wear the hijab and so on. Why do you think that was so? And did the young women feel the same way as them? The connected question also on gender. So this is Tamara Dragazzi. I'm totally butchering that pronunciation. Sorry, Tamara. So Tamara would very much like to go and study them after they've got married. So Pnina's comment about it would all change when they got married has resonated, obviously. And she wants to know whether the schools are ethnically mixed. Because when schools are ethnically mixed, mothers tend to be drawn into the lives of their children and have different experiences, witnessing different identities. So is that a factor? And this is the last bit of the question. Would you think of collaborating with a female anthropologist to study the same women in your cohort?
Well, I'll answer the last question first. Yes, definitely. I think that was one of the major flaws of my study. And the reason why, I mean, I couldn't help it because of cultural issues. I couldn't really, I mean, I spoke to lots of, I say lots, I spoke to some young women, and discussions with them were always very interesting and fascinating, but I couldn't, you know, I could go to and stay with a male friend's home overnight, but I couldn't do that. I couldn't do that with more female members of the community, which, I mean, I feel I ought to mention this point. I mean, there is a strong sense of patriarchy still in the community that I got. Women, attitudes towards women, even among young interlocutors, was not good. And I don't, I get the feeling that this is an idea that they pick up from home, maybe from their from male role models. Older cousins are always mentioned, fathers, older brothers. But there is a definite attitude among the men that they're in charge and their word is final and their father's words are final. So that's definitely a cause for concern. The point about masculinity and hijab, again, this is really interesting. And it leads on to this point about hybridity and ambivalence. The same guys who are going to Ibiza and, engaging in all sorts of hedonistic behavior out there would be the ones that when they settle, and this is the point that Pnina was mentioning, when they settle, they would want to go for a good girl who wore hijab and who was, who was chaste and all the rest of it. So there's definitely a tension between a traditional understanding of womanhood and their sort of, self-serving, carefree youth attitude of what is womanhood. At the same time, I have a suspicion, and this is based on anecdotal evidence from other parts from other Muslim communities and other Muslims that I know, that once they're married, the attitude that they have towards their wives is a very sort of didactic one, it is one where they're the boss, their word is final, and they appropriate Islam for that. They say, I'm in Islam, man's the leader, and then we're the leader of the family, etc. So there's a definite, there's still a gender imbalance there, and it would be great to work with somebody who could have access to the other side and engage and dialogue with the male side of things. To Tamara's question, hi Tamara, thank you for coming. I know who Tamara is. Thank you for coming. The schools, some were mixed, some weren't. So there were some schools in the heart of Berry Park that were predominantly South Asian in their population. Not always Muslims. There's a sizable Hindu community there. There's other communities there as well, but there was minority schools, and there were other schools on the sort of border of Berry Park, districts like Icknield, for example, where it was a much more mixed scenario. But again, sadly, I didn't get the opportunity to speak to mothers about their children, apart from very fleetingly when they'd come to community centres and I'd say hello. But beyond that, I didn't have any sort of meaningful conversation about them with regards to their children and their place within Lutonian life. So again, this is something that would be, I think, really interesting to explore in the future, if I can bring myself around to going back to Luton.
Great, thanks, Ashraf. So the next question is from David Gelner, and he would like to know whether you had any ethical issues whilst you were doing the fieldwork in connection with your funding, and how you were perceived as a researcher. So overlapping a little bit with the previous one, but this is to do with funding and ethics.
Hi, David. Thank you for coming. I'm really grateful. Great questions. Ethical problems. Yes, is the answer. I didn't get a lot of funding. They paid me a very, very small amount to write a report for them in the end, and they wanted me to write a report that put them in good light. And it did cause me lots of problems and consternations. But in the end, what got me out of this conundrum was that they were quite open about their religious theological interventions. So I could write that quite openly in the report, where I'd say I'd have to document. It was an action research project, so I had to sort of sit in where they're making interventions in schools and community centres and other places, and they would stand in front of it's a very sort of didactic pedagogy where they would stand in front of the class and say, well, Islam is Islam is the United Kingdom a land of war or a land of peace? And then they'd use the Arabic for that, and then the students will then respond and whatever else, and then eventually they would scaffold into saying that the UK is a land of peace. So for me, sitting there watching that, obviously I had huge problems with that way of teaching the children, where I had a whole problem with theological interventions anyway. I had a problem with the way that Prevent now has, in hindsight, has conducted itself. At the time, it was quite new, so I was still learning. But what I was learning while I was doing it, I wasn't, I was quite suspicious. So yes, there was an ethical tension that I felt personally, that in the end I could negotiate because I didn't have to write any untruths in the report, which saved my bacon really. What was the second? Sorry, Caroline. What was the second part of David's question?
Sorry, I'm just looking at other questions. I think you've answered it. It was the questions connected to the ethics of your position as a funded researcher, and how you were perceived.
Oh, how I was perceived. Oh, maybe I should add. I think I've answered how I was perceived already. Yeah.
Yeah, that was the overlap with the previous question. So I think the funding and how you dealt with the fact that you were coming in as an employee really of a particular project. I think you've answered that, so that's great. There's some really good questions that we've still got, and I hope we get through them all. I just want to nip to one that's come in very recently, but it sort of connects nicely to that last one. So this is again from Letitia Nagao, and she wants to bring Pnina in as well, if Pnina is willing. But for both of you to ask what you think about the importance of including the people we talk about in our ethnographies in the role of co-editor, or of having their approval.
Yes.
So I don't know who wants to start with that.
I can start with that if that suits. I think, this is something that I've been thinking about actually a lot recently over the last couple of years. I should say that this work was conducted over 10 years ago now. And I wasn't thinking about this sort of stuff quite as intensely as I am now. And I certainly think that following on from people like Linda Tuhui Smith's work, where one engages in collaborative ethnographies as a methodological imperative, I think I do subscribe to that approach actually. And I think that already in the work that I'm doing now, I'm trying as much as I can to force people that I work with to engage with it and to co-edit. There are some challenges to that though, because not everybody wants to, and some people are quite comfortable and happy for the researcher to go off and do that and see a copy and at the end, at the final stage. But it's definitely, again, an ethical area that anthropologists have mostly ignored, maybe not, with all the best intentions. But definitely, I think there is a high importance for co-editing.
And how do you, this is just me tagging on, but how do you think that would have worked with your project?
It would have been difficult because, given how they've responded to it now, I don't think they care. I don't think they care that much. But if I insisted on it, I don't know what their response would be, because I don't think they would be interested to do that. They'd ask me that, did you? I think I build up enough of a rapport with them that they knew that I wouldn't sort of throw them under the bus. There's nothing that they did that would merit me throwing them under the bus anyway.
Yeah.
But say if there was a project that I was involved with, say the work that I did in South Asia, for example, the bosses work. There are some sort of damning exposés of people and what they did in that work, and I got consent from them and everything else. But I wonder how it would work practically if I was to co-edit with murderers that I worked with.
Yeah.
So in principle, definitely, I'm totally on that decolonizing methodologies perspective, I see the importance of it for sure. But how then one goes about doing it is something that I think I need to, and the discipline itself, I think, needs to think through a bit more.
Yeah. Did you want to come in, Pnina?
Yeah, I sort of want to come in. I'm trying to think. It's very difficult to collaborate with the subjects of one's research because they're not academics. They don't think in that way. And although I've worked very closely with people over the stuff I've written, I didn't bring them in because it wasn't their writing and it would have been impossible for them. I've collaborated with a lot of Pakistanis, let's say. I've edited books with them and so on. So it's not that, it's just the actual subjects of the research. Writing something with them, it would have to be tailored to what I thought they would want to write. And most of them didn't seem to want to write anything, I mean, as you're saying. But I think it's very difficult and challenging to do that. And some of the things I write are critical.
Did you find that your participants read most of your works, Pnina?
No, so sometimes they did. I gave them all my books and, some articles. On the whole, I don't think they read them very carefully. I may be wrong. They were pleased to have them, I mean, as objects.
Yeah.
But I think, and also it was very complicated. Like I would write something and it would be about, say, community leaders. And I would change their names, disguise their names. And then they would complain that, why didn't you put my name? I'm a famous person, kind of thing. So it was very hard to know what to do with these kinds of things. It was difficult. Yeah, I think it's a problematic area because I tend to write about conflict and issues that obviously can arouse some suspicion and even hurt. So it's difficult.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the next question. We've still got quite a few to get through. So the next question is about education. And this is from Hilary Cross. And she asks, Ashraf, did you receive any insight from your interlocutors of their experience of education in this country and how it might have helped them or hindered them in developing a coherent sense of being British?
Ooh, good question. Education was something quite interesting, actually, that came up because education is always seen as something that was a pragmatic choice / tactic, that one should one should seek education in order to further one's lot economically and social status. And this is why there was such a different, they couldn't understand what I was doing. What the hell is anthropology? Why are you doing that? What are you going to do? Why aren't you a lawyer? Why aren't you an accountant? So the attitude, not with everyone, and I'll come back to the ones that didn't share this attitude, but mostly education was seen as something, as a stepping stone to becoming richer or towards social mobility that yields a certain profit. With regards to whether or not education would help them become better British citizens is something that I'm afraid didn't arise from any of the conversations that I had. It was I have to say, for people's age, they were very conscious of the fact that they're very conscious of the impression that they thought wider society had towards Muslims. And this might have been because of very, very sensational images, such as the World Trade Center bombing, such as the 7/7 images, and the fact that Luton was, as soon as 7/7 happened, Luton was the focal point of the whole country's attention. So there was a strong sense of leave us alone. We've not done anything, and that bred some resentment amongst a lot of my interlocutors. They were angry about that, And they had a very sort of potent, sort of streetwise sense of masculinity as well. They looked up to a lot of these drug dealers who were all sort of steroided up, huge guys and driving around in Ferraris and whatnot up and down the high street. So that linked into this idea of, look, we're going to defend our community, and everybody can, go to hell. There weren't any conversations that educate. I mean, in a sense, what we were doing was a form of education of them trying to become better citizens. So, the work that the skills project work, where we were doing the action research intervention, was that, trying to make them better citizens. But then the kids that were in the classes were bemused the whole time. They couldn't understand why somebody was telling them something that was obvious. I mean, they're like, well, to the question of is Britain a land of war or a land of peace? Everybody's like, of course it's a land of peace. Isn't one absurd question? So I think they had a very strong sense of what they thought being British was, and it was interfaced with being Pakistani or being Bangladeshi. And they felt that they didn't need somebody to tell them what that was. And it was very localized, very sort of local hegemonic idea of what Britishness was. And to them, it was being a Muslim in Luton and their community and their football club and their friends and, and then owning their neighborhood, and wanting to become wealthy and conspicuously consume as soon as they could. But great question, thank you.
Yeah, it is. Thank you for that question, Aleri. Okay, so a question now from Leila Zaki Chakravarti, which is sort of bouncing us back to the question of radicalisation. So she, lots of these people have thanked you for your great presentation, and I've forgotten to pass that on. So Leila thanks you as well. Can you tell us what the reaction of your interlocutors was to the radicalisation of Muslims and their connections with Islamic State?
Oh, so I can speak for my key interlocutors, who are the people that worked in the Salafi mission and who run this sort of migrant skills project. Of all the people in Luton, they were the most vocal against ISIS. I mean, you have to remember that ISIS, etc., happened after I finished my fieldwork, so I wasn't around at the time. But having said that, jihadism and al-Muhajirun and all of that was still very, very active in Luton when I was working there. And my interlocutors, because they shared a creed, they were Salafi, and the Muhajirun people and ISIS people claim to be Salafis, which, by the way, is fiercely contested by my interlocutors, my chief interlocutors. They felt a personal responsibility to challenge them. And that's why, that image that I showed earlier of my friend confronting al-Muhajirun is particularly pertinent, because they have tried for years and years and years to get these guys off the streets, to stop them from proselytizing. They almost every week they would meet them and try to sort of de-radicalize them themselves and have theological debates with them. And it just turned into a slanging match and, peacocking between the two groups. So they really, really wanted to reverse radicalization. They wanted to de-radicalize, and they're still working on doing it now. And I remember when the whole ISIS event happened, people from the mosque where I worked had pieces in all the different newspapers. I think they were on BBC local news radio as well. I think they were in the Independent, and I think they were in the Guardian as well, and other newspapers, where they, each time something happens, the Westminster bomb, attack happens, or the London Bridge attack happens, somebody from that mosque comes out and intervenes and says, "This is not us. These people are not Salafis. These people are on the wrong manhaj methodology, and we want to be at the forefront of making that point. We are British citizens. We respect the Queen." They're interestingly, they're very keen on the Queen. This is, we're under, because they take the hadith that the ruler of a nation you have a covenant with if they allow you to practice your religion. So that's a key argument that they make against al-Muhajirun and radicalized opinion, political radicalism, Islamist political radicalism, where they say, well, you can't, it's against Islam for you to challenge the British state because the head of that state has allowed you to practice your religion in peace. And so therefore, according to this set of hadith, you can't challenge it. And if you don't accept this set of hadith, then you're non-Muslim, which is a rhetoric that Salafis use. They use this concept of takfir, or calling each other non-Muslims, or that you've come out of the, it happens all the time. There was a lot of takfiri conversations that I witnessed when I was in Luton. So yes, I don't know, Leila, if that answers your question, but I think the Salafi sect itself is probably the most vocal, ardent critic of radicalization than any other group.
Great, thanks, Ashraf. We've got time, I think, for one last question. This is from Niger Sultana, and she asks, or he asks, apologies, I'm not entirely clear, a question about the differentiation between Pakistani and Bangladeshi forms of Islamic practice. Can we talk about South Asian Muslims, or is that too general a term?
Excellent question, brilliant question. I think it's a brilliant question. I think it depends. I think in South Asia, you can't really do it. I think there are sectarian overlaps on all across South Asia. For example, if you are a Deobandi in South Asia and you are educated in a Deobandi seminary in South Asia, you are more likely to have similarities with people in other parts of South Asia than you would necessarily in people in your local neighborhood. So there is a difference there. But at the same time, there are sort of cultural ways that people navigate religion in different parts of South Asia. And so there is a mixture of all of these things. Again, culture is not some, contrary to a lot of, I don't know, maybe legacy anthropological work. It's not a subbounded entity that stays static. It's always moving, it's always in flux, and it's always responding to all sorts of socio-historical, cultural, political contexts. So how that manifests in different places is always going to be different. However, there is a discursive, this is Assad, there's a discursive trend, I suppose, between people who followed particular sects, the Ahl al-Hadith in South Asia. In Pakistan will probably have a similar outlook to somebody in India and Hyderabad. So there's that complexity. The other point between Bangladeshis and Pakistanis in the UK is very interesting, because those young Muslims who subscribe to a globalized idea of Islam, this deculturalized, deterritorialized form, they tend to be either Salafis or proto-Salafis, in the sense that they share sympathies with the Salafi position. And the Salafi position is very ahistorical. Strip all of history, go back to the time of the Prophet, and that's how to be a good Muslim. So I think a lot's happening with a lot of both Pakistanis and Bangladeshis. And this is the same, this is the case in East London as well, as when in Tower Hamlets, where I've also conducted research since, where younger Bangladeshis in Tower Hamlets are identifying more with this idea of this global community of Muslims that is stripped from the hocus pocus, superstitious, cultural baggage of South Asia that their parents and grandparents had, and more towards this more cosmopolitan, globalized form of Islam, which is seen as purer and more certain and less corrupted by cultural influences. So there's definitely similarities between Pakistani young people and Bangladeshi young people now, a generational similarity now in diaspora. But having said that, in Luton, there is a big difference in terms of how Bangladeshi young men understood their community and went about their lives as they were compared to Pakistani groups. Pakistani groups were more agnate. They were, there were bigger networks of cousins and whatnot. the Bangladeshi groups were a bit more disparate. They were, you did have big families, but they had contacts with other parts of the country as well. I mean, both did, but they didn't have a stronger sense of blood tie as I found with the Pakistani Kashmiri groups. The other issue is with the Bangladeshis is that there was less Bangladeshis being attracted to the Salafi tradition than there were Pakistanis being attracted to the Salafi tradition. And that's because I would argue, this is purely my argument, that there is a much stronger sense of what Islam means for Sylhetis because of the historical presence within the hegemony there of this affiliation to Shah Jalal, to this sort of, this saint cult that has emerged in Sylhet and its hinterland. Vis-a-vis, I'm not saying that's not the case in Kashmir. There are lots of saint cults there, but I think it's a bit more homogenized in Bangladesh from my own experience and from my ethnographic exposure than it is amongst Kashmiri Pakistanis in Luton. I hope that answers your question.
Brilliant. I think we could go on, couldn't we? This is fascinating stuff, but we have reached the end of our time. I'm sorry to those of you who've asked questions and they haven't been answered, particularly Sarah and Robert. If you'd like to email them to info@therai.org.uk, then they will be passed on to Ashraf and he can respond by email. Thank you everybody else for your brilliant questions, and thank you to Ashraf and Pnina. I'd just like to ask Haneen and Amanda and Ted to pop back in so we can all wish you farewell. So thank you very much, everybody, for your participation. Thank you, Ashraf, for a wonderful presentation and for sharing your fascinating work with us. It's been really, really engaging. Thank you, Pnina, for your comments and your insightful critique of the book. That's also been wonderful. Thank you, everybody, and good evening.
Thank you for your wonderful sharing.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you as well, Caroline.
Pleasure.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.